This is a tour of Antigo's historic landmarks, homes and sites in Antigo, and the material we have here is based on archive photographs that we have at the Museum of the Langlade County Historical Society. And the tour starts at the Carnegie Library, which is now the museum. This building was built in 1905. It was financed by funds from the Carnegie Foundation. Carnegie himself funded many libraries throughout the U.S. and in fact worldwide. And this was one of them. This is actually one of his larger ones that he funded. And it has another significance in that it was designed by an architect, Alan Conover, who was the first professor of civil engineering at UW-Madison when the UW was first formed. He designed this building late in his career, and it was built in 1905 and opened as a library. It is now on the National Register of Historic Places. When it was built, the second floor was not set aside as part of the library. It had many different purposes. It was a teacher's training center. It was actually a historical museum for a while. It was a Red Cross center. All sorts of different functions. And the building itself was the library until 1997, when the city built a new library, and the Langlade County Historical Society, which was already in existence, it was formed sometime in the 1920s, took over this building and maintained it and turned it into a museum. And since 1997, it's been a constant struggle, I guess, to repair windows, to upgrade the furnaces, repair the roof. And most recently, major addition was put on the north end of the building, which makes it handicapped accessible. There's a new tower that blends in with the original structure that houses an elevator and restrooms on all three floors, the main floor, the basement, and the second floor. And it also contains tourist information and events outside of history. So it's really a centerpiece of the city.
You can go.
Okay. Here's a photo of the building under construction. They started building it in 1903. Then they ran out of money and they went to Carnegie and asked them for more money. There was a little bit of a pause. Carnegie did give them more money, and then the building was complete. And as I mentioned earlier, it was open to the public in 1905. Currently sitting next to the building, the museum, is this log cabin. This was the first home in what would eventually become the city of Antigo. It was built by Francis de Leglise and some of his family members and friends. He built it in 1877 actually, and brought his family here in 1878. Francis de Leglise was from Appleton. Well, he was born in Switzerland, but the family came over to Wisconsin when he was just a boy. He ended up fighting in the Civil War, then came back. He fought at the Battle of Gettysburg and Antietam. He was wounded there and came back in Appleton, trained as a surveyor, and became a timber cruiser, which meant that he scouted northern Wisconsin for areas that had potential for the lumber industry. And he saw some potential in this area, so he built this cabin as a home base and brought his family here in 1878, 79. And this cabin originally stood on the shores of Springbrook, right now somewhere sort of behind where the Lakeside Pharmacy is, where Antigo Lake is. And when he brought his family here, first of all, they built it on the shores of the Springbrook because they had no indoor plumbing. You did depend on a water source, a natural water source for water. And he had, at the time, There was himself, his wife, and 6 children lived in this cabin. They didn't stay there long. They soon built a grander house. But this was their first home, and it was the first house in, as I said, what would become the city of Antigo. The cabin stood in what was becoming a downtown commercial area, and it was in the way. By this time it was vacated, and in 1916 the thought was maybe they should tear it down. It was kind of in the way. But the city fathers decided that they would take this cabin, put it on rollers, which you can kind of see, log rollers. They rolled it down the street to the location of the library, then the library, now the museum grounds, and they preserved the cabin. It was restored and moved around on the library grounds from time to time, but the effort to save this cabin is pointed to by people in the Wisconsin Historical Society as the first attempt that they know of some community making an effort to preserve its history. I mentioned that the library, when it was first built, had a teacher training school on the second floor. It proved very quickly to be too small for the efforts that they were making to train teachers in the county or all around northern Wisconsin. And so a new building was built. It opened in 1926 as the Langlade County Teachers College. It's right across from the museum, and it's currently the Boys and Girls Club. It was a teachers college until from 1926 when it opened until 1971 when the rules of teacher training became more stringent, and you had to go to a 4-year college to become an elementary school teacher. Prior to that, it was a 2-year training program. Around the corner from the museum, right across the street from the middle school, is a house, an interesting house that was built from an assembly kit. This was Sears Roebuck, was one of the biggest manufacturers, but there were others that made kits. You could buy a kit, a mail order kit, and it would come to you in sections and spaced out, and then you would assemble this and make a house, build your house. So the parts that were related to the foundation or the structure, they would come first, and a few weeks later things like the floors, the trim, the windows, they would all come later, and you would assemble a house from a mail order kit. As I mentioned, there were many companies that did this, but Sears was by far the biggest. And I'm aware of, well, let's see, here's that house today, and it's right across the street from the middle school on 7th Avenue. And I'm aware of 1, 2, 3, 4 other houses in Antigo that were made from Sears kits, and one in Mattoon. So they were quite popular. And the style, the materials used in building these houses was really quite advanced compared to maybe what was available locally in small towns. So this house, the whole kit cost $3,278. You can't even buy a used car for that price now. And if you wanted storm doors, that was an extra $116. If you wanted screen doors, that was an extra $78. And if you wanted sheet plaster instead of lath, it was an extra $300 or so. This was in 1926. And here are just some of the, this is what the catalog looked like. You would choose, this is the hardware, the doorknobs, the hinges, and then there would be something for what style bathtub you would want or water heater, and some of the trim work and and fixtures of the house and the lighting fixtures. So this was all in the catalog. You made your picks, and then you had it delivered, and then all you had to do was put it together. There's another house in Antigo that was built from a kit. This is the Gordon Van Tyne Company that was based in Iowa. This is just an example to show you that there were other companies, and one of them was assembled here in Antigo. This is down at 10th Avenue off of Superior Street. It's called the Walk House because the man's name was Walk. And as far as kits go, there was a company that built kits for retail businesses. This is the George Mesker Company. They were based in Indiana, and he kept very extensive records. He sold 4 kits to various Antigo businessmen. That's in his records. I tried to track down all 4 of them. There were addresses, and none of them exist anymore except this one that you see here in the middle of these 3 buildings. It was most recently called the House of Diamonds, a jewelry store, but I actually don't know what it was used for when it was first built. But it was a kit, and the upper roof, the trim, this is typical of the kind of stuff that the Mesker Kit Company sold as part of its assembly kits. Okay, now we're back to the area around the middle school. Right around the corner from that is the Hanosek House. This is what it looked like in the early 1900s. John Hanosek was a very wealthy man. In his day, he was the wealthiest person in Antigo. He made his money in mines in the UP. I don't know why he came to Antigo, but he did, and he built this house where he lived. And interestingly, John Hanosek, in World War I, they were training soldiers at the what was then called the Opera House movie theater, and he bought that building, donated it to the city, and it became an armory, a trading place for soldiers that were enlisted to fight in World War I. And that's a whole other story for another time, the soldiers from this area who fought in World War I. And that's that house today. It's basically the same house. The garage here that you see around here, that's no longer there, but the house that you see in the insert is the same as the house as it was in the early 1900s. Now, a little bit down the street is the train depot. It's no longer a depot, but it's an example of, or represents the importance of the railroad in Antigo. The first trains came to Antigo in 1881. This was the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western, and it was Francis de L'Église, whose cabin we saw earlier, who convinced the railroad, as they were expanding northwards, to come through this nascent city of Antigo, just a cluster of buildings. And once Antigo had a depot, a railroad depot, it became an important city. The Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad eventually was bought up by the Chicago and Northwestern, and it became, they made it the northern hub for their whole network of trains. It was the center of the Ashland Division, it was called. So that means if you were going from Green Bay to Minnesota, or from Milwaukee up to Ashland, or anything, this is where you came to change trains. This is where the crew lived that went out to fix bridges and rail lines, all in northern Wisconsin. This is where they brought their engines for repairs, and well over 70% of the families that were living in Antigo from about the early 1900s to the 1940s and 50s had somebody working for the railroad. There were about 10 city blocks worth of buildings related to the railroad, and the only building that's still standing is this depot, which has been repurposed for apartments and commercial businesses. Right around the depot were many hotels, because if you were changing trains here, sometimes you would go to a restaurant or the bar, or if you were staying overnight. So there were a number of hotels in the area right around the depot. And one of the nicer ones was the Hoffman House, which you see here in the 1920s. And here is an interior shot of the bar. It was a father and son called Hoffman, and it was a hotel back in the days when it was still the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad, in the very early days, like the 1890s, 19-teens. And then it was expanded on in the 1920s, I think. And the building still stands, and in fact it's being renovated, and it will soon reopen as a restaurant. And right near the Hoffman House, right across the street, is the Opera House. This was the second one in Antigo. The first one was destroyed by fire, and it was built in 1904. It showed stage plays, vaudeville acts, movie theaters, movie shows, and it was a kind of highlight for the entertainment of Antigo. Here is their curtain, and it's a lot to look at right now. But all the many of the businesses in Antigo took out ads which were on the stage curtain, and so I just have this picture to show you that what the curtain looks like, and to see some of the businesses that exist here. Oh, okay. Here are some ads from the Antigo Daily Journal of different events that were taking place at the Opera House. Here's a silent movie called it was advertised as a six-shooting romance. Admission 10 cents or 25 cents for the cheap seats and the good seats. There was a roller skating rink in the basement. And as I said, there were vaudeville acts, plays. The high school held its prom there. And then in 1917, when the United States entered the war, the building became an armory where the soldiers trained. And that was John Hanasek, whose home we saw earlier, became he was the benefactor who bought this building and turned it into an armory. And after the war, it converted back to being a movie theater, but it was called the Armory Theater. And the building is now apartments. Here is the interior. You're looking from the stage out at the audience. And here I mentioned that it was the high school prom. They took the seats out where the audience would normally sit, and that's where the prom dancers, students gathered, and the orchestra was up on the stage where playing the music. The post office on Claremont Street is another building that's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was built in 1916, and there it is today, basically the same as what it was like when it was built in 1916. And this is just an interesting picture that made the Milwaukee paper, how in 1935 the mail carriers, there was such a big snowstorm that they had to go deliver the mail on skis. Up the street, a few blocks, is the courthouse. Again, this is Antigo's second courthouse, and it was built in 1905. There's an interesting story of how Antigo became the county seat, because in the early days when Antigo was first made a county, the real population center was that the eastern end of the county, Lilly and Langlade, were far more important towns than was Antigo. But in a referendum, enough people showed up to vote for Antigo, and they made Antigo the county seat. Then they built a courthouse. This is in the 1880s, and then by 1905 they built a bigger courthouse. And there it is today. It's been renovated some, but it's still basically the same building, including the artwork in the middle. Antigo in the early decades of the 20th century had two hospitals. They were basically house hospitals. Technology was not all that advanced, and this was a place where you would stay and be treated for various medical conditions. This one the building was built in 1882 by a wealthy real estate broker, and Daskam, and in 1911 it became a hospital. I say they're operated by Dr. E.J. Donahue. There were actually two Donahue brothers that operated this hospital, and this was on First Avenue and Superior Street. Donahue would eventually become the chief of staff of the new hospital when it was built in 1933, Memorial Hospital. And Memorial Hospital lasted until fairly recently, when the building itself was torn down and a new hospital was put up at the same site. Now, the Depression hit all over the U.S., including Antigo, and there were a number of projects that the federal government instituted to make work for people who were unemployed. And you can see in this paper from I think it was 1936 or 38, that the main headline was that Chamberlain and Hitler were in conference. This is where Hitler took over Czechoslovakia. It was a sort of black day for world peace. But the second headline was that the Antigo got PWA, Public Works Administration, money to build a number of projects in town, including a new water treatment plant. And at the time, the city got $177,000 from the federal government, which was half the price that it took to build this new water treatment plant. And there it is. It still stands. It's on First Avenue. And the architecture style, the Art Deco style, is typical of the style of the 1930s, the architectural style. In the north end of the town has the fairgrounds, which was has been a major draw. The first fair the city had was really just a display of farm implements that was held in the armory, the opera house, which we looked at earlier. But then the city and the county decided to buy this land at the north end of town and turn it into a fairground. And one interesting thing is in 1912, the county hired a pilot to just fly a plane over the grandstand, which you see up in the air there, and 10,000 people came to watch this flight. That's more than the population of Antigo. They came by train from all over the county just to sit and watch this plane circle the grandstand and then land. And then the people got a chance to sort of come out and check out this plane. Now, this is not that long after the Wright brothers and the first plane at all, first flight in the United States. And hiring this pilot, who was from Wausau, to come to the fairgrounds was the first case in Wisconsin history where somebody was actually paid to fly a plane. There were a few hobbyists at the time, but this was the first professional flight, you might call it, was some guy who took off in Wausau, circled the grandstand, and landed. around Antigo Lake, I don't know how well this is going to show up. Here you see Antigo Lake, and which was created by a dam of the, which is not the, oh gee, what is it? The 4th Avenue Dam. And it created this lake, and lumber companies built sawmills around there. They could keep their wood, their logs, in the water. And you can see all these numbers were logging furniture companies, or there was a Kellogg Mill was a big one, but there was a company that made broom handles, there was a company that made screen doors, seating. Crocker Chair Company was a big one. That's a little bit south of the lake. And a company that made barrel parts. So the lumber industry was very important here in the manufacture of wood products. And here is one of the larger sawmills. This is the Kingsbury and Henshaw Mill. And you see in the background, it no longer exists. Well, St. John's Church is right there. That's still there. And this was the home where the nuns lived. Kellogg's Pond, which was named for the Kellogg's lumber mill that was standing there. This is it in the wintertime, frozen over, and it was used as a skating rink. There was a warming house there, and it was a popular winter activity. I can't understand how these women skated with long dresses or skirts on, but they did. That Kellogg's Pond is now known as Antigo Lake. So back to the Depression era, again more funds. FERA is Federal Emergency Relief Action, I think, or Association. They granted the city of Antigo money for building bridges, and there were a lot of small bridges. And again, this was one of the Depression era make-work projects that they got in 1934, and they were able to construct 10 bridges. Most of them were quite small. They're over, like, there's one at 10th Avenue where the Springbrook goes under 10th Avenue. But the big one, the major one, was the Hudson Street Bridge, and that was kind of the biggest project at the time. And there it is in the 1930s, and it looks pretty much the same now. And you can see 1936 was when it was officially opened. And one of the other FERA projects was this building of these stone walls along the banks of Springbrook. And here I am, when I took this picture, standing on one of the bridges. I think this is 7th Avenue. And you can see the stonework that's meant to hold the stream, the Springbrook, in check during flooding. And then the city, in more recent years, has worked from this to establish this walking trail, and in the background you see the Heinzen Pavilion. So here's stuff that was done in the 1930s, and it's been reworked or built upon, advanced by stuff in the 21st century. So these FERA projects really established a good basis for the structure of Antigo. City Park is another interesting site within the city, and one of its significant things historically is that it was designed by a woman, Helen Benishek, in 1920, who did the layout for what plants should be where and how it should be laid out, which you see, you can't make out the details, but there's her plan on the left. And the interesting thing about that is Helen Benishek, she grew up in Antigo. She went to school in Madison and then came back to Antigo as a landscape architect. And she was likely the first female landscape architect in the state of Wisconsin. And she designed that park as well as a number of other recreational sites, and laid out a cemetery, I think, or two within the city, and designed that bandstand, which this is an old picture, but it's been modified, but it's basically the same bandstand that's now used for concerts in the park. When Delaglease first founded the city, he was very much opposed to alcohol. And he fought very hard to keep Antigo a dry city. He died in 1892, and within 3 years, 2 big breweries opened up in Antigo. One of them was the Antigo Brewery on the south side of the city, and they were forced to close due to prohibition. And then that was in 1919 that prohibition came in, and so they closed. The building was vacant for a couple of years, and then Kraft Cheese, which had started out in Chicago, they were looking to expand, and they chose Antigo as a site to build their second branch factory. So they bought up this brewery and converted it into a cheese factory, and it was a Kraft cheese factory until 1992, I think it was, and then Kraft pulled out, but the workers took over, and it became a worker co-op. Antigo Cheese, it was eventually bought up by Sartori. The building doesn't look quite like this anymore, but Sartori Cheese is still going at that same site, and it's a well-known, award-winning cheese company, award-winning cheese production. And it all started, the building itself all started out as one of 2 breweries in Antigo. We saw one hospital earlier. There was a second hospital, a house hospital, on 5th Avenue at the corner of Elm Street. And it was operated by 2 doctors, an uncle and a nephew, G.E. Moore and G.W. Moore. And they operated this hospital just like the one at Superior Street and 1st Avenue. It was a house hospital. Medical treatment was a lot different in those days. Most people went to a hospital and all they got was rest and maybe a doctor's checkup. The idea of having all this high-tech diagnostic equipment, MRI machines, x-rays even, all sorts of things, very fancy operating rooms with all sorts of technical developments. That didn't exist in those days, and so these were, I call them house hospitals, and this was one of 2 in Antigo. And this is, well, this is a few years old. The building has since been restored a little bit better, and but it still stands, this hospital on 5th and Elm. Here's a view of 5th Avenue at Lincoln Street in the 1880s. You can see it's dirt streets. There were wooden plank sidewalks, and the building on the right was the home of Antigo's first mayor, whose name was Thomas Lynch. So that's that building on the right, and here it is, his home. And you know, all the establishment of the fire department, police department, laying out of the streets and all that, that all happened during the when Thomas Lynch was mayor. The first mayor was responsible for a lot of things. He served 1 term, then he was off for a while, and then he served a 2nd term. And here's that building today. It's the Langlade Abstract Company. And it's basically the same building. Now we're back to where the tour started, which was the Carnegie Library, and then now the museum. And this is an old picture where we were planning the addition, and on the right hand side you see in pale red the plan, which has since been implemented, and the darker red color is the original building. So we built this tower onto the north end of the building, to house the elevator, restrooms, and some display material. So we've made a full loop around the city, started at the Carnegie Library Museum, and we've ended up back at the same place. That's the tour of historic Antigo as it stands right now. Who knows what we'll add to it in the future. Oh, I don't know if this is relevant. This tour started as a bike tour of the city. There were a group of us. I had organized this bike tour, and we bicycled around looking at these buildings. And then Dr. John McKenna, who was on the tour, he came up to me afterwards and said, if I were to write this up, the script of my little bicycle tour, he would help pay for publishing it. So we've published it as a little booklet, and that's available for sale at the museum.